I want to give most of the floor to my very good friend, David Starkey, Britain's leading conservative public intellectual, historian, obviously, commentator, and over the last year or so, often a travelling companion of mine. A good number of you may have seen our double act before, either in person or online, and we will be playing a good number of our established and popular hits, but we're probably going to be introducing some new material as well. As I said, we've extended the session to 90 minutes to maximize the number of questions that we can take from you. And it's a great pleasure once again to be joined by my good friend, Dr. David Starkey. David, thank you for your time. You give up so much time for our events. How the devil are you this evening? Joining us from Kent, I think.
That's right. I went back home to sleep for 24 hours after an exhausting week and indeed weekend. But there we are.
Okay, so you're refreshed and on top form. This
Sort
is
of.
great news.
At
Okay.
least I'm awake. At least.
Well, we'll settle for that. We'll settle for that. So, David, I want to kick off with what's now being dubbed the Starkey Thesis. When I set up Popular Conservatism, what is it now? It was 18 months or so ago. The essay question was, why were 14 years of Conservative rule so disappointing? I mean, might have been better, preferable to us having Corbyn as Prime Minister, but didn't really deliver on the actual outputs on any metric that you might think of, lower taxes, less regulation, more freedom of speech. And you have helped me answer that question and develop it. And I think you probably developed it in your own mind too, as we've been touring around the country talking about it. So a good number of folk on this call will no doubt know what is meant by the Starkey thesis. But for anybody joining us for the first time or who needs a refresher, can you give us just a quick sort of potted introduction to how your thesis and explanation answers my essay question about what went wrong for the Conservatives?
Well, I suppose the big thought, and the thought actually talking about how ideas change and how they shift, it's one that I became much more aware of as we were touring around the country. The fundamental point is that the Conservative Party, from its very beginning, has always been a compromise. This is the thing that we've got to understand between what of change you accept and what of change you don't accept. And when I say from the beginning, I mean literally from the beginning of the Conservative Party, which is normally dated to 1835 and the Tamworth Manifesto, Sir Robert Peel. In that manifesto, Peel begins by saying, conservatism is obviously, to a significant extent, about resisting change, about believing that particularly rootless change for the sake of it, what I call neophilia, is a bad thing. But he begins in a sense, the opposite of what you might expect by saying, I accept change on behalf of the party. He accepts the Great Reform Act of 1832, which does, in one sense, undo the historic constitution, but also does something else, which is why the very existence of the Conservative Party comes about, because what the changes of 1832, when you shifted the whole basis of parliamentary franchise, started to make it more rational, was it showed that the old historic constitution of England, going right back in literally a direct line to Magna Carta. In other words, it's already at that point, it's 700 years old. And what happens is that it was capable of reforming itself. That whereas everywhere else in Europe, you get the Ancien regime ending in war, bloodshed, revolutionary constitutional change. In England, what? You could actually pour wine into new bottles. So as a Conservative, you get Sir Robert Peel saying, great, I accept that. It's irreversible. We're going to go forward. His great problem, Mark, and I think it's been the great problem of every Conservative leader ever since, and only one of them has ever got it half right, is where do you stop? Where do you stop? Because, of course, and this is the great paradox, Britain then was both the most conservative countries and the most progressive. This is the thing. This is the extraordinary thing, because of course, and I think the only conservative leader who gets it right, he's not our greatest prime minister, but he's certainly our greatest leader, is Benjamin Disraeli. And Disraeli, of course, a great rival of Sir Robert Peel, comes up with this wonderful formula. What's interesting is how badly it's quoted in all the dictionaries of quotations. And it goes like this, and he gives it after the next great change in Britain's constitutional history, the Great Reform Act of 1867. The 1832 Act gives the franchise, well, to people like your parents. In other words, the prosperous middle class and whatever. The 1867 gave it to my ancestors, particularly the skilled working class, like my father, who, as I always point out, was a toolmaker. But Disraeli, in the wake of that, gives you, I think, the best formula, and the one that every conservative leader should have in their minds, even though very few of them have. What he says is this: Britain is a progressive country. In a progressive country, change is inevitable. Change is inevitable. And if you actually look in the dictionaries of quotations, the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations and so on, the quote stops there. So this just has a conservative leader saying the most unconservative thing, we've just got to accept change. But what Disraeli does, he goes on, as you would expect from somebody so able, and he narrows it down. He says, the question is change, yes, but what sort of change? Is it change in accordance with the traditions and customs of the country? In other words, exactly what happened in 1832 or what happens in 1867. You're capable of pouring the new wine into the old bottles and making the institutions work and work without breaking them. Or, he says, is it change in accordance with universal principles of international liberalism? This strange, alien, essentially French doctrine that he regards as the disaster, of course, and that's where we come sharply to the present. Because what happened in Britain in 1997, in what I call the Blairite Revolution, was we imported all of that. We imported the idea of the rule of experts in Quangos, and we imported what is worst of all, human rights law, which inevitably means the rule of lawyers and the reversal of the relationship between majority and minority. Traditionally, democracy is about the rule of the majority. Instead, we stood it on its head. So that's the big pattern. We could go back, and we should probably go back and look at the fact that of course, we all feel despairing. You outline despair. After 14 years, England, Britain, in 2024 was actually less conservative even than it had been in 2010, because we, the Conservatives, had gone along with what Blair had done. But the consolatory doctrine, the one that suggests we can rescue, and I want to put this idea, because this is what I think lots of people will be concerned about. We have been here before. We faced revolutions before, and we faced them down. And this is what is the extraordinary thing. Way back in the 17th century, when we had a revolution, which in some ways makes the French Revolution look pale. We were the ones who pioneered publicly trying a king and cutting his head off. We didn't humiliate him indecently, as the French did. We didn't bury his body in quicklime, but nevertheless, we did that extraordinary thing, but we reversed it ourselves. Britain took the decision. It didn't like the revolution it's carried out, and it wanted this thing called a restoration, which is why I've picked this idea of restoration as one of my great central themes as to how we put things right. Again, going back to the last really great leader of the Conservative Party, I think I can't be too disloyal to Kemi if I actually say the last great leader, can I? The last great leader of the Conservative Party, Margaret Thatcher, she inherited a situation very similar to the one that we are in now, and in very much your field rather than my field. Because, of course, what had happened in 1945, Britain had, as we can see now, more clearly perhaps than at the time, a genuine socialist revolution. That we became, the British economy in the post-war period was nearer to that of the Soviet Union than it was to America. And we really do need to understand that. And what did the Conservatives do in 1951 when they returned to power? They continued doing exactly the same thing. You even had a name in the 50s and 60s and 70s for what we call the Uniparty. They called it Butskelism, from Rab Butler on the Conservative side, and Hugh Gateskill on the Labour side, dominated by Keynesian economics, large-scale nationalization. You remember there was even a nationalized travel agency.
We had some nationalized pubs even.
There were nationalized pubs. It was completely demented world. And of course, overarchingly Keynesian economics, the extraordinary lurches of inflation that you tried to control by prices and incomes policies, and effectively 5-year plans, industrial policies. The whole
massive nationalized industries that the politicians will try and manage.
Huge scale. And the whole thing, of course, hitting the buffers gigantically under Edward Heath. And then this extraordinary moment. But I suppose it's a bit like the conversation we are having now, Mark. Somebody wakened up in the middle of the 1970s. It's, of course, famously Sir Keith Joseph, with the, of course, two institutes, two think tanks with which you were profoundly associated. The Institute of Economic Affairs, which you headed for a long stretch of time. When was that actually founded? That's founded
1953. They were ploughing a very lonely furrow.
Very lonely furrow. Yeah. Free market economics, and even, I imagine, the beginnings of monetarism, at least taking monetary and fiscal policy seriously. And then Keith Joseph comes along and sets up the other body, the Centre for Policy Studies. But he sets it up in a sense on the realization that you and I have been trying to put round, that a kind of moment of self-doubt. One calls it a Damascene conversion. He realized, and he writes it, he publishes it, he makes it the central theme. He says, I had called myself a conservative, but I hadn't been a conservative. I'd been a member of a conservative government, it's Edward Heath's, and we'd done nothing conservative. And it is on the basis of that understanding that you get the extraordinary Thatcherite counter-revolution, as I think we should call it, and of course the awareness with the election of Margaret Thatcher. Well, exactly all those years ago, we're celebrating the anniversary, 1975, the realization you had to spend the time from 1975 until the eventual defeat of a Labour government doing what we're going to be talking about subsequently, preparing.
This is really interesting.
Policy in detail. They understood it then. We've got to understand it now. And of course, the other thing is, Mark, again, as we're both so aware of, trying to alter public discourse, changing the language of politics.
This is really interesting, David. So, if you like, the problem, and thank you so much for that sort of dash through history from basically the foundation of what we would now call the Conservative Party at Tamworth, Disraeli, Thatcher, that there is a sort of playbook about how to tackle these things and issues and problems. And we're now clearly in a moment where we need to reset and restore rather than to go along with the Blairite change, which we effectively did 2010 to 2024. All of the inherent and indeed doubled down on it in many ways.
I think it's really important, again, thinking now strategically, Thatcher, remember, never needed to apologize for the previous Conservative Party, thanks to her incredible luck with Edward Heath's great sulk. Because, with that great elephantine sulk, going across his face is shockingly bad behavior. By definition, there was a rupture. What I think has got to happen now, there has been no such rupture. And in virtually every way, Kemi has avoided it. I mean, she's used interesting phrases, you will remember, in the speech, the good speech that she gave at the last party conference. She came up with this formula: when Labour follows its principles, it goes wrong. When we follow our principles, we go right. But she didn't produce, it's like a syllogism, but she didn't produce the intermediate term. Is why did the Conservatives go wrong from 2010 to 2024? Answer, of course, because they followed the policies of the Labour Party. And again, it was, as you and I both know, it was completely explicit. You get David Cameron, saying explicitly he was the heir to Blair.
Yeah.
It done completely deliberately. You get him saying, and this is immediately after he's elected leader, 2005. You get him saying, "I want a Conservative Party," and again going back to that Disraeli phrase, where liberals are happy. In other words, taking, if you like, the wolf into the fold, actually saying we want those people with those kind of ideas, and the complete embrace of the human rights culture, indeed the locking down on it, because we need again, put our hands in the air. It is under the Conservative Party that the outrageous manifestations of that, like non-crime hate incidents, are a Conservative introduction. It is under the Conservative Party that another area, one of those expert devolved areas, the whole business of climate change, is formally legislated, with that target of net zero set to 2020 to 2050, which again, bringing in the other side of the equation, if you set that target in law, Parliament binds itself. And if a minister tries to stray from that path, as Conservative ministers occasionally did, or indeed even Labour ones, the judges will will stop them short. They will say, you cannot drill in the North Sea. You cannot frack because it's against the law. And of course, even more extraordinary was Theresa May standing on the steps of Downing Street talking about burning racial injustice. What is a Conservative Prime Minister in the least racially conscious country in Europe talking about burning racial injustice and then foisting the whole DEI agenda on the civil service? Still worse, under her, you get the beginning with people like Maria Miller and Penny Mordaunt, shame upon Penny Mordaunt, of the beginning of gender self-identification for transsexuals. Extraordinary, deranged.
So it's that's on the analysis, the thesis, which I asked you to explain. If you like, Parliament has sort of bled out in two directions, and two new areas now have the life force of power, which is supposed to sit in our sovereign Parliament. On the one hand, these 400 or so quangos that are effectively running the country,
climate change and everything else,
and sentencing guidance, you name it, advertising standards, everything on the sort of day-to-day level, and the judiciary and the sort of human rights culture on the other. Such that I say, only half joking, in fact, not really joking at all, if you wish to affect immigration policy in Britain, don't become a member of Parliament or even the immigration minister, become a judge. You'll probably have more influence. So you've given us the thesis of what's gone wrong. The prescription is that we need to somehow abandon, kill off, privatise or renationalise fully into the structures of government and Parliament all of these quangos. And we need to repeal an awful lot of law that has empowered and indeed politicised the judiciary, like the Human Rights Act, the Equalities Act. That's the prescription. Have I got that right? That's the day one thing that you've got to turn your attention to.
I think it is the day one thing. I think we've talked a lot about the problem. We haven't perhaps analysed as much as we should have done, though we need to do it quite briefly. What the problem with, for example, the government of experts. I mean, when you put it like that, it sounds to be a thoroughly sensible suggestion, and indeed, one of the earliest and the most important, the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, did command at the time, I think, a lot of respect and regard. It was seen as being a good thing. The fact that that you've seen, in fact, acute mismanagement of the whole business of interest rates policy, of the public debt and so on by the Bank of England in recent years has undercut that. But what I try and illustrate, I take the fact that we can look at this in two big ways. And I think it really is important, Mark, that we again get people thinking about the big questions in politics. So much of it, you've got this wonderful phrase, retail. So much of our politics in the last 30 or 40 years, it's been this notion, well, everybody really agrees on the big question. It's which government is going to put 2p on income tax or take 2p off, this, which you would expect from a kind of uniparty. And I think this has got to stop. There are really big questions. The central thing, why do I bang on about historic constitutions? Aren't they boring and whatever? The answer is no, they're not. Because the reason that there's a thing called parliamentary sovereignty isn't just because, people strut around in funny clothes and the state openings of Parliament and everybody is self-important. It's because Parliament is the body that literally represents and has represented everybody in Britain. It is this extraordinary fact that the reason why, going back to Robert Peel, when he talked about policing by consent and that you can have an unarmed police force, it's because, or it used to be because, we felt through Parliament, through our ability to vote for MPs and to control them and to dismiss them if they didn't do what we wanted, we felt the laws they made were our laws. And
so it's actually the very model of inclusivity.
It's the very model of modern government.
Of inclusivity in particular.
Everything. And the fact that he was capable of broadening across the classes from gentry and aristocratic classes to the prosperous middling sort, to the working class, to even the poorest, those without property. The fact that, gosh, it even included women. There is and all of it without tearing down the old structure, unlike anywhere else in Europe. But the point is that it was this idea of what touches everybody should be decided by everybody. And what then happens under Blair is this extraordinary sense, and it's one of the things, again, that's very difficult to explain, that no, that wasn't the right thing, that the distrust of the people, the distrust of popular opinion, partly, I suppose, because of the experience of Germany and Italy and Spain, indeed, in the period before and during the Second World War, and the sense that Britain needed to adopt to the kind of European constitutions which had resulted from that, but also the sense that, well, do you know what? I think, frankly, a degree of contempt. I mean, the thing that characterizes so much of the left, and remember, the changes of Blair were never subject to broad discussion. They are partisan. They're local to a particular idea set, to particular groups of people. And one of them is the general belief that the people are ignorant. So you set up these expert committees. And of course, talking about big ideas, this is exactly what one of the two great, the ancient Greeks, who really give us the whole, I think, of our politics. There's this funny idea that our politics owes a lot to Christianity. I don't believe it for a second. The words are classical, they're Greek and they're Latin. And one of the great theorists, of course, is Plato, and he does believe government is the work of experts. And he again couples it with very firm ideas, like you even have myths, which is something we should probably talk about at some point, that justify that idea. But we, of course, are capable of testing it. And you see, this again is another idea which I think we've been developing as we've been going along. How do we know that what Blair did was so bad? The answer is the result.
Yeah.
Government now, even when it's run by people who believe in it, can't function.
Exactly right. And it looks like Labour might even be waking up to that, or at least some parts of it.
At some moments, Keir Starmer did, bizarrely. The man who is the quintessence of this stuff, the rule-bound human rights lawyer, when he talked about what was that phrase that he used about the civil service? It's gone out of my head. That moment when of course he was then immediately slapped down by the secretary of the First Division Civil Servants Association, Mark Sirota. So as usual with Keir, he has a moment when the truth begins to dawn on him.
But the candle is snuffed out pretty
and then
fast.
the candle, that's far too strong a word. this tiny little glimmer, like when you try to light a bonfire and you fail, and there's that little glow, and you see it tantalizingly flicker out. Anyway, going back, what is the test that single expert rule doesn't work? Well, there are two. You can put it very simply. Both Churchill and Teddy Roosevelt, the great American president of 100 odd years ago, both say the same thing. You want your experts, in this case, scientists, on tap, but not on top. And of course, we've just had the report of the COVID inquiry, which...
Farcical.
The farcical report. But what it does show, once again, is the insanity of that period of 2020, when we both know you had rule effectively by a single committee of experts. It was even called SAGE, like a group of Platonic philosopher kings. And it doesn't work because, of course, they're pursuing only one thing.
So there's no trade-offs, basically. You care only about COVID, or the Climate Change Committee cares only about climate change, not putting the economy back into the Middle Ages.
The Bank of England only looks at one indicator. And it is, as we all know, that is the worst possible way to take a decision, which is why we used to have cabinet government, where you need to weigh things against each other. And in the same way, pursuing the letter of the law is a deadly way of running policy. And in contrast with Plato, there is the greatness of Aristotle. Aristotle's that wonderful formula that he compares governing to cooking. He says, the judge of a meal isn't the chef, even if he's a Michelin-starred chef, with accolades and his own TV programs. The judge of the meal is the eater. It's you, the citizen. And this is what we knew unconsciously in Britain, and then we threw it away under Blair. I mean,
so there's really interesting, David, when you were saying, giving us this sort of run through of constitutional history from Cromwell forward, and that your expertise in constitutional history, it isn't just a sort of nice academic dusty book thing. It is the correct lens through which to look at our present predicament. And this, I suppose, is a bit of a communications problem question that I've got from Valerie Coker. But nevertheless, you and I are going around attempting to communicate this idea. She says, I find David's explanation of how Tony Blair took sovereignty away from Parliament very convincing. But I suspect that the average voter has no real understanding as to how it affects anything. Same as saying we should leave the ECHR. I suspect people only hear abandoning human rights and assume that they would somehow lose their rights, whatever that means. How can we get the message across in a way that the average person will understand and respond to? Now, I guess to some degree, this is a kind of Saatchi and Saatchi style question about what the slogan is and the rest of it. And you and I have talked that probably at some point we need to market research, some opinion polling into working out how that works. But what's your first blush thoughts about that? I appreciate we go around talking mainly to the politicized, people who are members of the party.
The convertible.
The convertible, or at least people who take a keen interest in politics. But, my experience of knocking on doors, never has somebody said to me, well, can you please explain what your position is on Northcote Trevelyan and the reform of the civil service, right? Whereas what they've usually said is, why am I paying so much tax and my wages aren't going up and nobody's fixed the potholes, right? That typically what you at least hear at first instance are these retail end politics about, understandably, their wage packets, the tax rates, the failure of they can't get a GP appointment. That's what you hear at first blush, not grand constitutional principles. So What are your thoughts about how we kind of communicate this in a way that kind of means something to the average person? The only reference point I have on that is the Brexit referendum, which you could have argued was a complex constitutional matter, but clearly infused. Well, 17 million people voted to leave, but also clearly infused people who had never voted before. The more votes cast than in any British election in history, more votes cast for a single proposition than any election in history. How do we get the Starkey Thesis and the Great Restoration into, if you like, what worked for Brexit in 2016?
Well, I think Brexit was literally, not simply formally, but actually a dress rehearsal. Why there was that vote was precisely the sense something had gone wrong. Take back control. I mean, people remember, anybody who is British has been brought up, however distantly, on that sense. We are in charge of our own destinies. And of course, Europe, literally, our membership of the European community meant literally that we weren't. And people understood that. It's not very difficult to explain. And you know what? I think there's something else that we need to understand. I've just been reading the establishment shot at explaining all of this lot, which is Vernon Bogdanor's book, published in 2009, on the new constitution. In other words, acknowledging that indeed, exactly what I've been saying, that there was this process of revolutionary change. And do you know what he attributes it to fundamentally? Our joining the EU.
Right.
The moment we joined the EU, all the basic rules were effectively thrown through the window. However,
in favor of a more universalist liberal European
in favor of a universalist liberal polity. And above all, the first thing that went through the window was the idea that the British people could control their own destiny. Instead, our destiny was subordinated to our sovereignty, our ability to control ourselves, was merged into this larger entity, however much it was fudged to begin with. And of course, it was fudged to begin with. And if you actually read the small print, yes, it was spelled out. But the Lord Chancellor at the time that Edward Heath took us into what we all called the common market pointed out that inevitably there was a major shift of sovereignty. And if this fact was not spelled out, he says very clearly, it will come back to bite you. And that's exactly what it
happened.
did do. And you saw somebody like Margaret Thatcher, who'd been at the heart of government, effectively the scales falling from her eyes. As she dealt more and more with Europe, and the final business, of course, of the creation of the single currency, the setting up of a European central bank, and so on. Those extraordinary comments during her last appearance, in Parliament, when she, when she's asked what's her reaction, and I think it's Dennis Skinner pipes up, "Oh, she's going to be governor," and she of the Central European Bank, and she comes back, no. No. This represents the undercutting of the sovereignty of each people of Europe, she says. So I think that that's the idea you need to get over, that the joining of our joining at the hip with the European Union. And if you read Bogdanor's analysis, you see even in 2009. He thought it was absolutely impossible that would ever be reversed.
Yes, so interesting. And therefore, actually, our membership of the EU, look, I'm not going to compare it to the Civil War, but it's another instance in history where we took a turn, we stuck with it for a while, and then we reversed it.
It is precisely, and it seems to me that if you we've been going around, we've been listening to people, we've been talking to people. There is that same sense of something having been lost, something having been taken away, that sense of self-government having been taken away. Because people talk about a revolutionary mood in the country. I don't think it's revolutionary. I think there's something sadder. There's a sense of loss. There's a sense of nostalgia, of deprivation. Again, people are talking about, we want our country back. There there is, and of course, all of this is again very closely associated because alongside the joining of the EU came the importation of the European Convention on Human Rights and its fundamental challenge to the whole way we'd always done law. And it's very striking, again, when you look back, the convention is drawn up bizarrely by conservative politicians. I think Mark, and we need to understand this. I've been pretty harsh about the conservatives who went along with this. But I think it's very easy to understand why people behaved as they did from 1945. You'd been through, within everybody's lifetime, the second of these terrible wars. There was a passionate desire somehow to stop it happening ever again. And I think the thing that's most surprised me, because one of the things I've been doing as a result of our work, I've been reading things that I would never, ever otherwise have read. And one of the things I read was Quentin Hogg, Lord Hailsham. I just remember Hailsham, rather distantly as this bell-waving, great rotund, vehement, highly intelligent Tory. In his book that he writes on conservatism in 1947, that's 2 years after the Great Labour victory, he begins by saying, as of course conservatives, we would welcome world government. And he, of course, in 1976, is the first person of any political party to talk about Britain as having an elected dictatorship and to talk about conservative, a desire for a written constitution and a Bill of Rights. So you can see what brew it all comes out of.
Yeah.
But what we've discovered, I think, is just how terribly it goes wrong. As always, you ask me, how would I persuade people? You began by talking about the things they do complain about. And one of the reasons that we can't build anything, why the economy is frozen dead, is, of course, because we have reaped the consequences of doing what was intended from 1997 onwards. We've created a rigorous separation of powers. We've enormously empowered our judges, and they do what judges are supposed to do. They stop Parliament doing anything. So, in other words, the criticism always of a separation of powers, in which you, as in the American Constitution, you separate out the judiciary, the executive, and the legislative, is they all fight each other. And of course, the Americans at least have had couple of hundred years of getting used to this. We just did it at one fell swoop with, again, what's extraordinary, Mark, no serious popular consultation, no broad-based political agreement, no broad-based discussion. But what we can see is its consequences are disastrous. Everybody admits, even on the left, as you were saying, we've never been worse governed.
This is really interesting. Now, in terms of putting it right, and what our pitch should be, is a couple of interesting questions from Martin Bristow. Thank you, Martin, and good evening. Martin says, much of the problem in our politics relates to the very poor quality of our politicians on right and left. How do we address this and produce clear-thinking, decisive leaders? Is it indeed possible? Do we also need another Sir Keith Joseph? I'll spare your blushes. I think you're our new Keith Joseph, David, but you're on the, he almost didn't need to be an MP. He could just as easily have been the chairman of the Centre for Policy Studies or something. He was probably too much of an intellectual to be a politician. But there's a quality of politicians issue there. I mean, is that really the problem, or do we get what's often called this sort of false memory syndrome, right? That you can. My interests other than politics are vintage television and football, as you know. And I can remember a producer of Doctor Who said, everybody says Doctor Who's crap today that used to be brilliant in the past, but they only remember the best episodes in the past. They don't remember the average ones. So if we look back to the politics of the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, we remember the best. The mediocre just slips from our mind. Whereas actually on a day-to-day level, perhaps mediocrity has been the norm for many a year. Matthew Cox asks, fixing the UK is something that will either require a huge crisis or politicians willing to end their careers in order to burn their political capital needed for proper, potentially unpopular fixes? Are we past the point of saving the UK from the doomed state that we were born into in 1997? So I guess there's a mixture there about both quality and bravery in the political class that we would need, because it's not just enough for you and me to be right about this. We need to get it done.
Absolutely. I think that there has been a very marked decline in the average. There's still some very able people. It'd be completely wrong not to recognise them. And one can mention the odd one. I mean, somebody who has actually left the Conservative Party. So I am making, as it were, an objective comment. Somebody like Danny Kruger is a politician of a stature which is absolutely comparable with the best that's gone before him. Of course he is. And there's more than a handful of others like him. But I think part of the shift is, and again, we've got to be honest, part of the shift is the result of Britain ceasing to be a world power. I mean, think of it. I laugh, you laugh, we all laugh at an ass like David Lammy. But remember, he is sitting in the same desk when he was Foreign Secretary as Palmerston. When Palmerston sat at that desk, he was probably the second most powerful person in the world. We've got, in other words, one of the reasons why our politics is less attractive is because you control less, you can do less, you enjoy, to be blunt, less power. Politicians like power. The other thing, of course, that resulted in the extraordinary, what you could say, parochialism of our politics was precisely that we gave so much power, by definition, with joining the EU, to the EU. That not simply, and this again is really important, it's not simply did it affect how we were governed in the sense of the formal rules. It meant that I think a quite spectacular decline, not simply in our politicians, but in our civil service. That they were the whole structure of our government in huge swathes of policy, not simply economic policy, but environmental and so on, was simply exercising delegated power. You were told what to do. And we also showed ourselves,
and we've never sort of lost our muscle memory on a lot of stuff.
I think a lot of
one area that I focused on was trade. Well, there was no British politicians or indeed experts have been involved in trade because we've given it away since the 1970s. So how to negotiate a trade deal with India or America was just...
And also, I think the other thing is how to recover the self-confidence. How to recover the self-confidence to say boo to a goose. I mean, what is striking is that some countries preserved it. Look at French aggression. Look at the absurdity of ever calling France a genuine ally. I mean, we really do need to start calling things by their proper names. If France can take a hostile stance to Britain, it will. And once again, but you see, there's also been something else, and I think it goes back so much to what I was talking about with somebody as intelligent, I mean, brilliantly intelligent as Quentin Hogg was, as legally grounded. This passionate belief in internationalization, that in a sense the state was only a conditional organization, that Europe, the world, all of that was bigger, better, and that we were really that wonderful phrase of Thomas More when he talks about the status of Britain when it was part of the universal church, that in a sense the government, well, I should talk about England, shouldn't I? The government of England was just the equivalent of a parish council within the great structure of the Western Church. We became like that. Now, is there a way out? Well, I think your second question there put his finger on it. Why was Thatcher able to do that break with the past? Because of the double crisis of the 70s. And it seems to me, in other words, the IMF intervention in 76 and the general breakdown of government, because what happened in 79, the country simply became ungovernable. And I think we are seeing all of that, dare I say it, on speed. I mean, it really is. It really is, on a kind of chemical high going on. I would argue, in fact, that the structures are much more broken than they were in the 70s, because what's very striking is how quickly the British state was, once it had somebody like Thatcher able to take the helm with all those qualities you talk about of intelligence, of courage, of serious preparation. The state was able to shift from an essentially socialist model to a basically free market model, from one kind of economic management to another kind of economic management very, very quickly. It was again in 1997. I think what we can see now, I'm afraid, is a more radical breaking.
Do you think, therefore, that what's sort of needed for that, and one of the themes that you've been insistent about, and I can remember on, I have many lunches, I'm pleased to say, but one of very few that has changed my life was meeting you just before the launch of PopCon. And you didn't merely caution against, you were extremely firm in your view that I should not use the term revolution. That is not what I meant, that what we needed was a restoration. And actually a potential divide, I guess, on the right of politics is those of us who are looking to restore and those of us who think we should just burn everything down and then see what we can build from ground zero. But is your view on the dysfunctionality of the state such that we sort of fix parliamentary sovereignty, we get all the powers back there, and we entrust to the 650 men and women who represent us? But do you think we need to torch quite a lot of the bureaucracy, like shut down the Home Office and build something completely new to deal with our police force and our borders, for example, right? So not just the Quangos, but the bureaucracy that is supposed to be the administrative arm of Parliament, does that just need to be almost shuttered and rebuilt on a blank sheet of paper? But I mean, the Home Office is famously the least functional department in Whitehall. And my God, that is a high bar to be the least functional department in Whitehall.
It's a very high bar. I think what we really need to do is something, dare I say, Mark, even more radical. We need to recognize that the bureaucratization of the state is not simply an administrative catastrophe, but it's a social catastrophe. One of the things that's gone so badly wrong with Britain is because the state tries to do everything, it leaves far too little for people to do over their own lives. If we go back, not very far, if I look back to my father's youth, when in many ways he experienced the most terrible deprivation, 4 years of unemployment from 31 to 35, walking with my uncle twice to London from Lancashire in search of work and not getting it. But what's striking about looking at his diaries is the number of voluntary organizations that he was involved in. Clubs that were designed for saving up a few pennies for holidays, for burials, religious activity, walks, self-education, extraordinary range of things. And what the increasing dominance of central administration has done with the multiplication of the NHS, the complete takeover of education by the centralized state, all forms of welfare and so on. Remember, before that happened, all of these things were run locally by local people, and that's been a most terrible, terrible loss.
So I don't know here, David, whether I suspect you're channeling Edmund Burke and the little platoons, the little platoons. But are you to some extent channeling David Cameron and the big society? I was initially attracted by this. I thought if he's serious about this really could change the nature of society. That you will have these little platoons. But it ended up just being give a bit of a round of applause to the Cub Scouts and the Mothers Union. It didn't really end up as much.
No, it was even worse than that, Mark. What it broadly amounted to was the state's takeover of charity.
Yeah.
What happened was the major charities started receiving huge infusions of money from the state. And so you know in this bizarre, I mean, if you look at things like the Refugee Council, if you look at it, I will take a level bet that the great bulk of its income comes straight from the state. And what does it do? It uses it to campaign against state policy on trying to limit immigration. And we've seen this thing. So the charities, most of them are no longer properly independent.
They're sock puppets.
They're sock puppets. They're sock puppets. They becomes, because again, one of the things we haven't talked about is that although the state is so acutely dysfunctional, what is very striking is everybody running it, be they a member of the civil service or of the judiciary, of the tribunals, or of the Quangos, or of teachers, of university staff, or of the BBC, all basically have the same set of liberal internationalist opinions. They're all printed from the same sheet of cardboard, cut from the same die, and it's a set of opinions, of course, which they think of. It's a centrist dad view. They all think that this is the natural, the right, and the proper view of the world. There's no accident about the BBC.
Well, they also think it's uncontestable, right? So they don't believe they're taking an opinion.
And I don't think he's wicked. I don't think they're wicked. I simply think that they exist in a very large bubble in which everybody they meet and everybody that they met in the course of their lives, everybody that they socialize with, everybody they're at university with, everybody that they meet when they go to the gym, they all say and think the same things. Unfortunately, about 85% of the population doesn't. So we have, and this is the profound paradox. And again, going back to the Vernon Bogdanor book, the point at which he gets it so radically wrong, he had the idea that the new constitutional state that was emerging from 1997, with the apparently prominent role for the referendum, would result in a new populism. And of course, it's resulted in completely the opposite. It means that we have a more narrow, effectively new aristocracy with its own values, with, I would argue, a vastly greater gap between the rulers and the ruled than we had under the old aristocracy, because the old aristocracy enjoyed whoring and sport and,
all of the good things in life.
All wave your glass in the air. The rest of the population did, and I think there was a far less of a gap, because of course the new elite is exactly the kind of people, if you remember, that George Orwell is so brilliant about when he talks in The Lion and the Unicorn on who the typical members of a socialist party are. When he describes them with that wonderful hatred which Orwell is so good at. The Quakers, the sandal wearers, the vegetarians, and again, clearly he hated gay men too. That amazing description of those two hugely fat gay men on the bus, both of them wearing matched pistachio shorts stretched so tightly that every dimple in their ample backsides was visible. You can see them. And these, of course, are the people who, being now very unhumorous, comprise the party members in 1984. And they are, of course, it's exactly that same gap which is analysed so brilliantly by David Goodhart. The somewheres, the universalists, sorry, it's getting right, the anywheres, the universalists, and the somewheres.
Who are rooted.
And you and I are rather odd, because in most ways we should be
we should be the anywheres.
We should indeed, and instead
we are the somewheres.
We've reprimitivized, our knuckles drag on the ground for some reason, and we're there. But in what Goodhart is about is this gap of values between the elite and the rest.
So, David, because I wanted to move on, we've got like dozens of questions. I'm not going to be able to get through them all, but I want to give the audience as much of the floor as I can. But before I do that, and there's a couple of questions in this area. How is this going down, do you think? So you and I have spent, the best, huge chunk of our time over the last, year or two going around speaking to conservative associations, reform associations, speaking
Anybody who'll listen to us.
basically anybody who will listen on the sort of, I guess, tilted to the centre right. We also spend quite a lot of time speaking to, one-on-one basis with, senior MPs or advisors to MPs or journalists or the rest of it. You and I had, a catch up with Danny Kruger, for example, a few weeks ago. What's your audit of how this is going down? Because, I'm persuaded we're right and that we need to evangelize, but I'm kind of reaching for, is our evangelization working? Are we getting more and more people in? Is it receptive? Or are we just sort of, waving a flag and nobody is, we're running this flag up the mast pole, but nobody's saluting? How many people are saluting?
I think quite a lot. I mean, again, it's very easy, isn't it, to see the world as a mirror of what you want. It's very, very easy to do that. But I think there are a lot of signs of change. The one essential sign of change is that the idea is becoming almost banal. You're seeing all sorts of people that are a completely different political approach, even people like Fraser Nelson, whatever, playing with the idea, beginning to grasp, yes, something radically has gone wrong. I think so. There's a kind of inchoate shift. I think also you can see literally the idea being taken up. I mean, look at what Rupert Lowe has done. Rupert Lowe actually has called his movement the verb from restoration, restore. Yeah. He's actually picked that idea. When I did, and this is just showing the spread. You mentioned conservative and reform. I'm pointing out that it's gone vastly beyond that. Ben Habib has just done his launch podcast for his new advanced party. Who did he ask to launch it? Me. Mm-hmm. This sounds very self-reflective, and I apologize for it. But I think we are having an effect. I think that there serious work is being done. Think tanks have picked up the idea. Some of the work of preparation is already underway. I think that is being understood. There is vastly more to do. But
tell me, because we've got a lot of questions about this, which I'll come to, but. It was interesting when you were saying earlier about how Margaret Thatcher was able to make the break, partly because Ted Heath stormed off in a sulk, and therefore, there was a division between the old failed party and the new party, or the new approach within the Conservative Party. But this time round, we might have seen this not as a division within the Conservative Party, but a new force arising from outside it. I mean, the rise of reform is a phenomenon you and I have not seen in our lifetimes.
Yeah,
and what's your take on? I mean, let's put aside the electoral maths. I'll come to that at the moment. Lots of people are asking about how do we unite the right and a pact and that sort of thing. But where is the more fertile ground on which you are trying to grow your crops? Is it reform or is it the Conservatives? And are the crops a bit different? Are some of these ideas landing more with the Conservatives, or an appreciation about how to perhaps implement them landing with the Conservatives? I mean, for example, a question that came up, I'll try and dig it up now, was about something that you said at the Reform conference in Birmingham, from Simon Deere. At Reform in Birmingham, Dr. Starkey said that Nigel Farage had not yet bought into the need for constitutional legislative reformation. Does he think that's changed? But I just wanted your general overview.
The answer is yes. I think the answer is yes. I think, in fact, that we are now in the position where on the reform side, at the heart of reform and the heart of the advisors, there are, I know, and I can say definitively without actually naming names, there are individuals absolutely committed to this idea. And one name I can name, because his own speech, his own utterances have made it clear, is somebody whose name has come up repeatedly, Danny Kruger,
yeah.
the in charge of preparation for government. In that first press conference that he gave, whole sections dare I say, it could have been written by me, and indeed possibly were indirectly, without wishing to. I mean, this is the point at which one regards plagiarism as a wholly good thing.
Oh, well, absolutely. I mean, we need to be plagiarized to death to win this.
I want to be plagiarized to death. That's right. And as I said, it's very clear with Rupert Lowe, it's very clear with Ben Habib. And some aspects, again, are under Kemi. Again, this much clearer language about the need to repeal the European Convention and the realization of both the legal and the symbolic importance of the convention. But what I think has not yet really penetrated, especially on the conservative side, is the overall picture that what went wrong amounted to a kind of deformation in the Blairite, and we can call them the Cameroon years, and that this is the fundamental reason that things have gone so badly wrong. And I'm very surprised about this, because I said, when I referred to that triple formula, the missing term of which Kemi didn't utter, Labour gets it wrong when it follows its principles, which are broadly socialist and internationalist, so it mismanages everything. Conservatives get it pretty well right, because they follow free market on the one hand and proper representative government on the other. But then what went wrong? We hoard after strange gods. We followed what Blair wanted. And until conservatives say that, I don't actually think there's any reason why anybody should take the Conservative Party seriously again.
Well, what about and then I'm going to start machine gunning questions. What did you think about the intervention of the chairman of the Conservative Party, Kevin Hollinrake, last night, who on his Twitter account appears to have implied, certainly everybody is inferring, that the gold badge that you're going to get if you become, I don't know, some new member of Reform or something, the Reform haven't yet been clear what the qualification will be to get this badge that you'd wear on your lapel, that he drew a parallel with Adolf Hitler giving out badges to the first 100,000 members of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. What do you make of what Hollinrake said there, and the fact that the Conservative Party, well, I wouldn't necessarily say have completely doubled down on this, but definitely haven't taken their chips off the table on this one?
I think it's deranged. I mean, I think it's shameful, and I think it's deranged. And the thing that's so shocking, Mark, is that this is the direct aping of the language of the extreme left. Remember, the attempt at smearing, let's use that word, everybody who has got problems with the human rights settlement, or doesn't think that a refugee every minute is a good idea, as far right. It's part of that process, and it's still worse. It is the peculiar leftist position on this that goes right back to I talked a lot about the extent to which our world was shaped by the 1945 world. Remember, 1945, the great problem was we defeated Hitler with the aid of an even worse tyranny, that of Stalin. And the whole of that optimistic settlement of 1945, it's like the apple in the Garden of Eden. There's a serpent there. It's corrupted from the very beginning. It's corrupted by the Soviet Union, because, of course, one of the things that we desperately wanted to preserve by the early forms of human rights was freedom of speech. The last thing the Soviets wanted was any freedom of speech. Dictatorship, on the contrary, as we see from the dictatorship of multiculturalism, it can't allow criticism of it. You've got to limit freedom of speech. How did the Soviets do it? They did it by saying, oh, well, we've just defeated this infinitely wicked phenomenon of fascism. We can't give freedom of speech to fascists, can we? Which is why, and you use that idea in Austria today now. You cannot actually deny the Holocaust except as a criminal. It's a criminal.
Nor in Germany.
In Germany. It's a criminal act to do it. You have an acknowledged limitation on freedom of speech. That's why the left is so eager to tar everybody with the fascist label. And
whereas we expose Holocaust deniers through debate.
Yeah,
I mean,
I mean, that is the only effective way of doing it. And it's very striking, if you look at David Irving, who was the pseudo historian, the great Holocaust denier, he was not destroyed by being sent to jail. He was destroyed by my friend and colleague, well, occasionally friends, sometimes colleagues, Sir Richard Evans, brilliantly in that trial, demonstrating that he lied as a historian, that he falsified evidence. That's how you do it. You do it by debate. But for the chairman of the Conservative Party to resort to that kind of hope not hate smear is, one despairs.
I agree. I agree.
Simply despairs.
David, we're going to machine gun you some questions. So
Thank you very much.
Quick fire from me, quick response from you. Here's an interesting one from Richard Watkins, which should be simple to answer. I'm just going to give it a bit of a prelude. PopCon hasn't published much. We've gone around talking a lot, and that might be partly because I got a bit tired of producing several 100,000 words a year at the IEA, and I thought talking was probably more valuable pound for pound than writing. Nevertheless, Richard Watkins asks, will the Starkey Thesis be published as a book?
Yes. In fact, like you, I like talking too, and indeed, I've got a dangerous fluency. One of the reasons that I don't have as huge a pile of academic work as I should is that I can extemporize lectures. So most academics publish their lectures and call them books. But anyway, from the end of March, as you know, Mark, but we can now say it publicly, I am going temporarily to cease the task of touring and evangelizing, and instead I'm going to settle down and write the Gospels. So I shall be working, first it will be on Substack, and then it will turn into a proper publication on all of these ideas. And that should be available, we hope, sometime towards the end of next year or the beginning of the year following. But what it will happen, the sections will publish on Substack starting in April.
So we can watch each episode and then buy the DVD box set. Yeah, perfect. Sarah Kinlock asked an interesting question. We haven't really touched on this. There's so much to go through, but she says David has been very critical of the current monarchy. Can he please explain what should be the role of a constitutional monarch? And does he think there is any future for our current monarchy, especially as it has now become a rather expensive celebrity/charity monarchy that is pushing certain agendas?
Yeah, I mean, I think the real problem is a monarchy that survives has to be the central national symbol. And this, of course, is often easier if most of the surviving European monarchies, setting aside the Spanish, are the monarchies of smaller countries with rare languages, and that remember the immersion into the great common ocean of world English is a great problem when it comes to defining our identity in general in these islands. I also think that, and the questioner touched on this point delicately, I think, and somebody like, for example, Dominic Lawson went public on this in a recent column, the fact that both the King and the Prince of Wales have nailed their colours to the mast on the whole business of climate change and climate emergency is a profound error. It was all right back in the days when Charles was a young man and we giggled happily at him talking to plants. When it is a major and very fraught issue of government policy and in its current manifestation directly responsible for deindustrialization, it is a catastrophe.
That's really interesting. So you think that the monarchy could pick causes, but they need to be, if you like, fundamentally uncontroversial. Generally wanting to preserve the environment is okay. But taking a particular view that big business isn't cutting its carbon emissions rapidly enough, which
is a disaster.
Prince William seems to be saying, is politics.
It's a complete disaster, and again, it shows a fundamental misunderstanding of the monarchy that Downing Street has been happy to encourage them to do it. I mean,
Yeah.
this is a catastrophe. But the essential role of the monarchy is that of a parliamentary monarchy. The sovereign parliament is king, lords, and commons, and the king again set the whole thing off on such a bad footing by, for the first time since 1689, excluding Parliament from the Abbey. It's unthinkable. It's simply unthinkable.
Now, Angela Hughes asks an interesting question. This goes back to, well, I think I can safely say one of your great political heroes, and then via you, he's become one of mine, David. It doesn't mention him by name, but you were touching on Disraeli and the extension of the franchise. Actually, Angela Hughes asks, does David think the rot set in with Britain when the working man got the vote? When the only people who could vote were landowners and property owners, the empire was at its height. As soon as the vote was given to people who had no vested interest in wealth, the country seems to have taken a nosedive. Did it all go wrong from Robert Peel? We should still be resisting the 1832 Reform Act.
I'm going to become even naughtier. I think that if you want to argue the problem with the franchise, I'm afraid you would have to argue the problem with the franchise is the female franchise, the feminization of politics, the shift towards welfare, which is a central part of that. That is where things have gone wrong. I mean, and I think that the general feminization of life, as we're all beginning to understand, has major
But
problems.
most of the feminization's been done by men.
I was going to say but we what we need to start doing, Mark, is to recognize the necessity of some welfare, the necessity of some moderation of aggressive masculinity and so on, but equally to stop being carried away on these great waves that we swing wildly towards extremes. I mean, we need an urgent revival. And again, unfortunately, Conservatives got it at least as wrong as Labour. The great slashes of defence expenditure, the first of them took place in 1991.
Yeah.
And this is the catastrophe, as we're seeing. The reason that we sit impotently by whilst what is happening in the Ukraine happens in the Ukraine is because we took these decisions, and they were
We
made.
decided to spend money on welfare, not
We
defence.
decided to
And then
spend
we're
money on welfare.
surprised we don't have a big seat round the table when it comes to a defence matter.
Precisely. But the worst thing is that we let justice, the fundamental purpose of the state is to do with the monopoly of force. That's to say, you have to be able to protect your people from the outside, and you'll be able to withstand the criminal and the violent from within inside. And what we've done with the state, and again, a terribly important role in all of this played by the idiotic policies of George Osborne, is we've let both justice, criminal justice, the actual administration of the law, of prisons, of the probation service, rot in a fashion which is disgraceful. And we've done exactly the same with the ability to defend our frontiers. And another thing, Mark, which I think is hugely important, we've let the whole public sphere deteriorate. You look at the dignity of Victorian public buildings. I remember vividly your description of when you were at court recently, of the sordidness of the whole thing, of the fact it was run down and tatty and coffee stained and shabby and bits of sellotape stuck everywhere.
Just to assure the audience, I was acquitted of all crimes.
I shan't go into detail and say you emerged with a very large smile on your face.
No, but you're right. It is shocking. There doesn't seem to be any majesty anymore.
That's right. And you cannot have justice without majesty. A state, the very term majesty wasn't originally, remember, Mark, it wasn't originally a term for monarchs. It was the majesty of the European, of the Roman people, the majestas of the Roman people. It was their collective sense of themselves, and a public face of the state that is tatty, run down, constipatedly horrible, it commands no respect. but you see, that is all part of the extent to which I think we have lost self-respect.
Yeah, I agree with that. Now, next question. There's several people, so we're amalgamating them together, but it's on the same theme. And again, if you don't mind, David, I'm going to have a little bit of a preamble. When I was at the IEA, I rather liked the fact that we would be written up in the national newspapers as the hugely influential IEA, the most powerful think tank, and therefore lots of people got their knickers in the twist.
Mysteries, dark mysteries.
Yeah, and then lots of people got worried about. The truth of the matter was, if we were that influential, why didn't the Conservative government do anything I was advising them on? I mean, typically did the exact opposite. But anyway, I was happy to go along with that myth. And one is emerging now a little bit about the Fabian Society, I guess. Joan Bucket, Craig Southern, Jeff Mitchell are all interested in your view on the impact of Fabianism on Labour and how we can defeat that in civil society. Now, none of Joan, Craig, or Jeff have suggested any grand conspiracy here. And I, for obvious reasons, given my antecedents, rather admire think tanks that are able to change opinion. And PopCon has been set up to try and change opinion. I want us to be influential. But on the battle of ideas there, the Fabian Society seems to have been alighted upon as somehow the slow but steady intellectual guiding light of the present day left, I guess. I mean, I think in the immediate situation, it's the Resolution Foundation who have basically now run the OPR and the economy, from what I can gather. But what you would have heard these before. I think you and I have had questions on this before at public meetings.
I mean,
what's your take on it?
I'm profoundly skeptical. I was at LSE, which is, for most of my academic career, which is the hotbed. It's where Fabianism really got going. I think part of it's that idea that the old badge of the Fabian Society, which showed the wolf in sheep's clothing. It's that idea of doing it a little bit in the dark. I think what's really important, what is the real influence of LSE? What is the real influence of the left? Why has it been so destructive? Well, one of the reasons I think is and this is more your area than mine, Mark, it is the sheer inanity of left-wing economics, especially in the form they assume nowadays, in the idea of the magic money tree and all the rest of it. The insanity of what Rachel Reeves is trying to do, bringing about growth by talking about it, whilst you hugely increase taxes and regulation at the same time. We know it will not work and it cannot work. But what I think is the thing that has been supremely destructive about LSE, and I say that despite having had some very happy years there and many friends there. It was associated with Sidney Webb in particular and his wife Beatrice, which is the idea that all government should be by bureaucracy, that the state should do everything. And this is what they've succeeded in. That whole pattern that Edmund Burke talked about, that is the foundation of the old freedom of Britain and England, that multitude of overlapping bodies, some of them local, some of them national, some of them religious, some of them charitable, some of them this, that, the other, has vanished. And is effectively, you've created this huge, sprawling, bureaucratic monster of the state that does everything and does it badly. Is parasitic on broader society and inhibits freedom, self-government and autonomy. That's the problem. And
really interesting.
The person who understood that right from the beginning, the only public figure the most eminent public figure who passionately opposes the creation of the modern civil service, the Northcote Trevelyan reforms, is Disraeli. Disraeli, with his completely extraordinary range of reading and whatever, immediately says what it will do is we will go the way, and he actually gives the examples. We'll go the way of Ming China. We will go the way of ancient Egypt. We will fossilize with the suppressing embrace of a bureaucracy. It's right from the beginning.
I wanted to ask you a bit, and then I'm going to seed in some questions because they're on this. They're on a very specific topic. But you and I, David, are members of the Conservative Party. But at some point, some sort of electoral vehicle is going to need to win an election, and then it need to implement this. And on that matter, I'm basically agnostic, right? I do not have a loyalty to the Conservative Party that is akin to the loyalty to my football team. If Southampton go down to Beezer Homes League Division 7, I will still be a season ticket holder. If the Conservatives go down to the electoral equivalent of Beezer Homes Division 7, I'm not particularly interested. So some people are in the Conservative Party. It's their social network and the rest of it. And that's fine. I kind of admire that, or at least I understand it. What do you think needs to happen to unite the right? I mean, as it stands at the moment, if you take a snapshot of a very divided party political landscape, but Reform could potentially win an election enormously if it was held today, because they would be on 30%-ish, and sort of all of the other parties would be on 12 to 17%-ish. And the nature of the electoral system is that could deliver you an absolute landslide. I mean, this could
as Labour got,
as Labour got, I guess, in the same way. But even more so now, I think Reform are the only party polling consistently above 20%, and they're into the 30s. And in first past the post, it's the gap that matters. So I quite understand for those reformers on the call, or indeed in the mind of Nigel Farage, sort of, why should I worry about anything? We're growing and heading towards victory. Let's just stick with the strategy we've got. The Conservatives at the moment don't seem to be able to fight their way out of a paper bag, at least in terms of making impact on the electorate. What's your thought on how these ideas need to coalesce into an electoral vehicle that wins an election? So we start with the ideas, your thesis, and me and others trying to, win the battle of ideas. Next thing you need is an electoral vehicle to win an election. Third thing you need is the competent governance when you have won that election. What's your present take on the electoral vehicle and where we find ourselves? And, Martin Bristow again says, does David think that a Reform Tory party merger is essential given the unpopularity of the Conservatives resulting from 14 very wasted years? How should it proceed? Chris Penny asks, how should the Conservative Party best confront Reform? Should it take it head on? Or as Kemi suggests, I think she uses that anecdote about wrestling with a pig. Don't do it because you'll get very muddy and the pig will enjoy it. Well, the pig has definitely enjoyed Kevin Hollinrake's intervention, I would say. So he didn't follow the advice there. Should Des Cooper, should the right unite first and then prepare the policy agenda, or will we only unite when the electorate forces us to? Christopher Marshall, Martin Bristow again, and Joy Goldsmith ask about the prospects of an alliance. Joy specifically wants to know how the current leadership of both parties could be convinced for the need of unity on the right of centre of British politics. What are your takes on that? I mean, I feel a bit unfair. You're the great ideas man rather than the sophologist, but nevertheless, this has to be got right, otherwise it's all in vain.
I agree. I mean, my view is, and we've discussed this endlessly, I think, and this is why I'm doing what I'm doing, why I shall be writing what I'm writing. I think that what we have to show is that broadly, almost everybody on the right, apart from what's left of the liberal fringe of the Conservative Party, is essentially agreed on the fundamentals of policy. This seems to me, in other words, I think that what you need is, traditionally you wanted an agreement of men before measures. I think in fact we need an agreement on measures, and then maybe the irreconcilable personal differences will cease to be quite so irreconcilable. That's the way around I think it should go. And this is why I'm campaigning as I am. I mean, again, another figure that we haven't mentioned who has got a very important part to play in this and has always been very forceful and eloquent. And many of you, I imagine, watching will have seen the two of us perform together. I've performed with Mark, but I had a memorable I use that word deliberately, performance with Jacob Rees-Mogg at the Reform Conference. And Jacob has been one of those who has always been clear about the need for the reuniting of the right and what's going to happen. And this is no news to you, Mark. Jacob and I will actually be doing a regular podcast, which will explore and with his experience of on-ground politics and actual real electoral politics, such as I haven't had directly, this idea of the reuniting of the right, above all through policy. That's what we'll be trying to do. And I think that this again is something which, everybody involved and everybody listening to this. I mean, I understand why a lot of people in reform feel as bitter as they do. I understand why quite a lot of people who've still survived in the Conservative Party feel as bitter as they do. The betrayal has been very serious and profoundly damaging to the nation. But we will make it worse if we persist with the bitterness. And this is sectarian folly. We have real enemies. Real enemies. And they're not just our enemies, they're enemies of our country and everything that's valuable in our civilization. We are fools, and worse than fools, if we spend time fighting ourselves.
Yes, I would agree with that. I mean, there might be. I mean, one thing I will give. I know some people in Reform disagree with this, but Nigel Farage, great credit for, and this is not mirrored oftentimes on the continent of Europe, is that he has emphatically kept the hard right out of the Reform Party. Okay, occasionally you're going to find somebody who said something completely mad on a Facebook page that you didn't know at the time, and you haven't known this person, you've got to kick them out. But the kind of fascist, thuggish street right, he has kept completely out. Nigel Farage is a mainstream politician. There's no two ways about that. There is a problem that he and Kemi Badenoch seem to have absolutely no time for each other whatsoever. I mean, one of the reasons I'm so annoyed about what Kevin Hollinrake has said is I think it was last Christmas time, I did a television interview with Lee Anderson. It was based around the Conservatives wading in that they didn't believe that Reform's membership ticker was accurate because they'd looked at the back end. I mean, another, Conservative Party draw the pistol only to work out which foot to shoot yourself.
And that was Kemi directly.
Yeah, that was insane. But my basic theme then was, quite apart from the ideas, treat each other with respect, because we don't know when we're going to need each other. We don't know if we're going to need each other, but if we do, let's make sure that relations are extremely cordial, mutually respectful.
We will need each other, Mark. We will need each other. And it is inconceivable that the talent in the Conservative, because there is real talent, we sneer at our politicians. There are at least, I would reckon, a couple of dozen people there of serious talent. It would be insane for them not to be involved in this enterprise. We, again, the sheer destructiveness of the path down which we are going, there is equally, of course, a need for a clear out. I mean, you and I have talked about this. There are Conservative MPs, there are individuals in the machine of the Conservative Party who should not be there. That has to be said. And it is profound folly that they remain and that they're encouraged to remain. But that is not true. I mean, again, of the bulk. I mean, let me give you another example. I mean, you've seen me do it when I've been touring around. One of the questions I often ask at a reform association, I make the confession. We both make the confession. We remain members of the Conservative Party. You know, it's like you in Southampton. It's get the boos and the hisses out of the way. Boos and the hisses out of the way first. But then you may remember I've often countered by saying, come on, we be frank, you be frank. How many of you were members of the Conservative Party or voted for it? 80% put their hands up. This at the moment is a fratricidal struggle. And it's necessary. because of the Conservative Party betrayal of itself. It's exactly as it did in the
Well, more importantly, it's betrayal of its voters rather than of itself.
Yeah, well, it's both, because a political party is its voters.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
In the same way, the church isn't just the clergy. Forgive me, and it's something we've got genuinely to regret, and but above all, we've got to be big enough. You know, I was joking about masculine virtues and whatever. There needs to be. We don't want the cattiness and the childishness. There needs to be, alongside courage, there needs to be that openness and good fellowship. Those were all things that Conservatives used to value. We need to do again.
Really interesting. I just want to finish with one final question from me. We've had more than 200 of you on the live call already, and I've tried to batch together your questions and get through as many of them as possible. But on the Starkey thesis, on what I think has been an extremely good 2025 in moving the ball forward, what do you want to see happen in 2026? You've already you've already been too kind to us with a couple of exclusives here. Your book will be coming out tail end of 2026 or early 2027. You and Jacob are going to be pairing up to do what will be a must not miss podcast together. But outside of the actual activities, where do you hope we are this time next year if we repeat this call? How will the ball have moved forward? Why we'll be able to look back on this event on the 24th of November 2025 and say, wow, we've managed to get things into a much better place than they were last November or last Christmas. What do we want to happen that would be good, markers for progress continuing? I'm assuming no early general election for the sake of this argument.
Right. I think there are two things which are very clear, and again, were striking also back in the 1970s. What happened from 1975 onwards, there was serious work of preparation. There's got to be that idea of the Great Repeal. Sounds easy, it's not. It will be fought every inch of the way by the whole of that anywhere establishment that we're talking about. So it's got to be legally watertight. It's again exactly the difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2, as everybody will remember those extraordinary scenes immediately after Trump's inauguration when he goes to the Oval Office. He's got that great pile of executive orders, the pen, the television cameras pointing straight at it, and that Thomas Cromwell figure of Stephen Miller, the deputy chief of staff.
Who's drafted all of these orders, basically.
We need that. We need the equivalent within our constitution of that activity. But the other thing is, we need, and we referred to this, we've got to begin the process of recapturing language. We were talking about Brexit. We need the equivalent of the Vote Leave campaign. Now, I don't think the Vote Leave campaign will be fully underway, but the equivalent of Vote Leave, the equivalent of Vote Restore, but what I hope we will see within a year's time is the foundations, the outlines of that.
A mass movement,
the creation of a mass movement, because I think it's bigger even than reform is now. I think there's a very broad sense across all people of goodwill, and I actually believe, I don't believe that there is this indifference to politics. One of the things that we've discovered on our touring of the country, I think, is a huge increase of interest in politics, precisely because it seems to be important. People realize things are going desperately wrong. So I think there is not only the need for a mass movement, there is actually the immensely fertile soil for it. And I would like to see the beginnings of that getting underway.
David, it's been a brilliant hour and a half. It's always a delight to talk to you. I always learn something. I always feel inspired. And almost as importantly as that, I also have bloody good fun, which matters too.
Yes, which is another conservative virtue. It's the left who are po-faced and stuck up and tiresome and solemn. That word, I believe in seriousness, but I don't believe in solemnity. I don't believe in that awful po-faced self-righteousness, which is incarnate in Sir Keir Starmer. Yuck.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. And what a good parting piece of advice. Be serious, but don't be solemn.